Я думаю, будемо розпочинати.
Let's start, dear friends. I am Valeriy. I'm chair of the UCMC board. Today, we have a rather symbolic day, July 9th. Of course, every day is significant for Ukraine when HIMARS are coming every day, but the 9th of July is a benchmark in our relations with NATO. Today is 25th anniversary from the day of signing about signing charter with NATO about distinctive partnership. 25 is a symbolic date which points out to the fact that the story started not yesterday, not the day before yesterday, but 25 years ago. Today we have rather distinguished speakers and among those who were at the signing of the charter 25 years ago, this is Mr. Volodymyr Ogryzko, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 2007-2009. We have also Ms. Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, Chair of the Committee of Ukraine's Integration into the EU. We also have representatives from the Ministry of Defense today, and I've just mentioned those who are here in the room present now, but of course we will see in course of our event other guests who will attend our event online and contribute to it. I would like to thank to you the NATO Center for Information and Communication in Ukraine, and to our colleagues who deal with the information studies, and also I would like to thank to the program of security studies of foreign policy, Ukrainian Prisma. Without further ado, I'm giving the floor to the Ms. Emine Dzheppar, First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Dear participants of the event, I'm happy to participate in it, which in the event which is devoted to the 25th years of a distinctive partnership between NATO and Ukraine. The signing of the Charter about distinctive partnership had become the roadmap for Ukraine. The Charter has founded Commission Ukraine Data, which coordinates cooperation of Ukraine with NATO in different areas. During the 25 years, we had happy and less happy moments. At the Bucharest summit, it was decided whether Ukraine will become the partner eastern partner of neighbor, then participation in the Kosovo operation, then the in mid 20s the decision about neutral status of Ukraine after annexation of Crimea, and in 2014, any illusions about true intentions of Russia about destroyal of Ukrainian nation disappeared, and the new course in Ukraine's foreign policy was reflected in the constitution in Ukraine in 2019, and after the full-scale invasion of 2022, we have no doubts that this is the true course, and Ukraine eventually will become the full-fledged member. If we would not stop Russia now, they will eventually violate all the international agreements. And during the latest summit of NATO, the NATO member countries decided that the Russia Federation is a strategic enemy. And if they were not provided the up-to-date military equipment, they may become the part of contributors to these threats, which now Russia is making on Ukraine. All the response to all the threats and humanitarian aid and allocation, accommodation of many Ukrainian refugees. This is a huge help. Also, the packages were discussed, which provide for extended humanitarian aid in Ukraine in a short-term perspective, and about future programs which will allow the coordination in military area between Ukraine and NATO. Extension of this cyber assistance of NATO in the view of future partnership. The decision about which was made in Tallinn is a huge step forward. President Zelensky emphasized that the understanding of the eastern flank of NATO should be revised. For example, in Poland, it could be created the hub NATO East, just like the successful project NATO South. This may create good grounds for involvement of the NATO partners and Ukraine into joint activity, which would allow us to reach progress, for example, in counteraction to human trafficking, illegal migration, and other mutually useful projects. Perhaps this year will become the decisive one. Ukraine now contributes to a final resolution of the issues of the entire civilized world. Glory to Ukraine. Thank you, Emine Dzheppar, First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. We have heard a lot of interesting statements, which we will discuss today, and the NATO new concept is very interesting, which we also will discuss today. Then please to give the floor to our speaker. I would like to emphasize to the distinguished experts and to the audience, just in case you need translation into Ukrainian, you can take the earphones at the end of the room. With this, I will switch to English and give the floor to a person.
Invite for our conversation and just not comment but represent position of NATO. One of the very important organizations, it's NATO Information and Documentation Center in Ukraine. For a long time work very close with Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian civil society, Ukrainian think tanks, and now it's even more important when we go for, I believe, the final cut of our long way to the membership of Ukraine in NATO in the future. And with pleasure, I want to pass the floor Mrs. Kleine, who is Director of NATO Information and Documentation Center. The floor is yours.
Дякую. Шановні друзі, український
Dear friends, Ukrainian nation today is fighting for its right to live in its own land. Ukraine is fighting for the values which are fundamental to all of us and pays a very high price for this freedom. You pay with your health, with destroyed homes, and with a huge number of injured people. Ukrainians had demonstrated outstanding courage. We stand by Ukrainian people, and of course, I would like to mark this important day, 25th anniversary of signing charter between NATO and Ukraine in more favorable conditions. But despite the horrible conditions, we can mark it. And to mention the role of our long-term partners, I would like to thank to the organizers of the event, to the Center for International Security, Ukrainian PRISM organization, and of course to the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. By the way, in May we marked another important date, the center, the anniversary of the Center for NATO Information and Documentation Center in Kyiv. Actually, this year it is also 25 years old, and we work for the sake of security of everybody. And glory to Ukraine. Thank you so much. It was very pleasant to hear your welcoming speech in Ukrainian. Thank you so much. During that years, much had been done to extend information to raise awareness of Ukrainians about NATO. And due to the activities of your center and due to the NATO representative office activity in Ukraine, this cooperation had become part of our landscape, and we have many achievements in this area. So we wish us all that eventually we will hear about the positive decision. Anyway, we have much to do before the accession, and in the meanwhile, I would like to give the floor to a person who participated in that decisive summit, also in Madrid, and the highlight of today's event is from Madrid to Madrid. And my question to Mr. Volodymyr Ogryzko, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine in 2007-2009, who was present at that signing event 25 years ago. Thank you, Valeriy. I'm happy that I've been very convinced Euro-Atlantic course supporter, and 25 years ago I also was supporter of the Euro-Atlantic course, and I was privileged to work such people as Mr. Udovenko, then Mr. Tarasyuk, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Garbulin, who was the chairman of the Security and Defense Council. And of course, I would like to mention the then President Kuchma, who clearly took pro-European, pro-Euro-Atlantic position despite any other aspects which could be brought in. But for him, the Euro-Atlantic perspective of Ukraine was quite clear. So today we are beginning the new stage of the process. And Mr. Javier Solana, the UN president at that side, was also with us. So all of the intentions of all the stakeholders coincided. At that time, I worked as the advisor to President Kuchma in foreign affairs, and what impressed me most during that summit was the fact that our Eastern partners like Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic got the green light for the accession, for the NATO accession. We were very much inspired with that fact, and we thought at that time that that was also would be also very quickly opened for Ukraine. Unfortunately, we were a bit naive at that time, and neither in 1997 nor in 2008 nor in 2014 or 13, NATO did not want to see us as NATO members, and that you can do nothing actually with that. There is either wish to have you as a member country or no wish like that. Let's be very frank that some of those countries who already became the NATO member countries, they are not even at in many areas, not even in the military and combat area at the level of which Ukraine has. But nevertheless, they are members to NATO. Because NATO was frightened with Russia, and actually about aggressive nature of Russian Federation, it was possible to hear from Georgia, from Ukraine, from the Baltic countries, from Poland. They were continuously reminding about the Russia's aggressive intentions, while those countries were named as Russophobic countries, or countries with Russophobic positions. And due to that perception of the Eastern countries, Eastern Bloc countries, the NATO members were unable to see the genocide in Chechnya, and they pretended they did not see what happened in Georgia, and it was presented in the OSCE as a small Georgia attacked the Russian Federation and showed aggression to it, which is of course nonsense. And only now they have got the understanding which had to be got many years ago, and a bit naive vision that the Russian Federation was a country with which it was possible to come to agreement, or I do not understand whether it was naivety or whether it was a result of political corruption. But the fact was that there was a strong belief that it was possible to come to agreement with Russia. And only February 24th, 2022 had changed this vision. And the policy of appeasement of Russia, even from Ukrainian side, which is very much surprising. It resulted in what we see today and what had happened to the entire world today. But at the same time, we see clear victory of democracy globally today. The democratic countries are able to make correct conclusions, right conclusions. And I would like to emphasize triple times today that today all the NATO countries had eventually understood that all that Russia's full statement that the national interests of Russia should be respected, that it was important to allow Putin to preserve face and other strange things, that all was nonsense. And today NATO understood that Russia is an enemy. You cannot have friendship with an enemy. You should counteract to the enemy and try to restrain the enemy. Actually, this is the free translation of what is written in the diplomatic language. We want to preserve security, and the Western and NATO countries today understand that security could be reached only together with Ukraine, and a substitute for the security guarantees for Ukraine, that's again something not serious. The only true security guarantee is Ukraine's membership in NATO. NATO has to do for Ukraine what it has done recently for Finland and Sweden. Quickly stretch up its help hand and allow us to prevail with this help. Let's go further with today's discussion, and with this I give the floor to Mr. Alexander Kraev, Head of Strategic and Security Studies Group. Thank you. I would like to thank to all the organizers, to our North Atlantic partners, and to the armed forces of Ukraine for this opportunity to have this discussion and to continue with our diplomatic frontline work. With this, I would not prevent my colleague Andrei Karakuts from the Center of Applied Research and allow him to moderate, but before, several rules. Our speakers will have some time for presentations. Then we will have discussion after all the presentations. Ukrainian and English languages both are applicable in our discussions. And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Baiba Braze, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy. Good morning, Ukraine.
Participants of today's event. 25 years ago, on the 9th of July, NATO and Ukraine signed the Charter of a Distinctive Partnership. It's a landmark document for building an enhanced NATO-Ukraine partnership. And what a partnership and relationship it has been. Back in the 1990s, NATO was going through a profound transformation to meet the changing circumstances of the countries coming out of the Cold War from the Iron Curtain and joining the common space of Euro-Atlantic security. The alliance was establishing new formats for the engagement with democracies in Central and Eastern Europe. And of that, an inseparable part is and was Ukraine. Accordingly, in 1997, NATO signed the Charter on a Distinctive Partnership with Ukraine, and years of close and dynamic mutual cooperation followed. So in 2002, Ukraine announced its intention to join NATO, and we intensified our cooperation to help Ukraine on its path. In 2008, at the Bucharest summit, NATO allies welcomed Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership and agreed that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Then, in 2010, Ukraine suspended its desire to join NATO, and Ukraine's parliament passed a bill confirming the country's non-aligned status. But we continue to cooperate in the framework of annual national program on various projects and mutually beneficial interests. And, of course, Ukraine continued to participate in NATO-led peacekeeping missions and operations. And then, in 2014, the year we all remember, the first time Russia invaded Ukraine, and after Crimea's illegal annexation, NATO and allies stepped up their political and practical support for Ukraine, training soldiers, creating interoperability on Western type of standards, and thus, through years of cooperation, we really developed a very close relationship and partnership between civilian and military forces, political and other relationships. We have worked together on shared security concerns, on challenges, on kinetic and hybrid threats. And indeed, we highly appreciate Ukraine's contributions to the Euro-Atlantic security. Then, as we all remember, and I think that date will stick in our memory forever, on February 24 this year, Russia launched a brutal aggression against Ukraine. We all stood and stand by Ukraine in its fight for its independence, for its future, for its right to defend itself. President Putin was preparing. It was not an attack that was sudden, and we knew that he was preparing. So we did everything possible to prevent the attack. We engaged diplomatically, we released intelligence, we tried what we could to deter Putin, to deter Russia. That was not enough. Russia attacked Ukraine, and that attack is ongoing. It changed many things. It changed how we at NATO perceive Russia. If in 2010 Russia was characterized as a possible partner for NATO, this year at Madrid summit, NATO leaders said that Russia poses the main immediate threat to the whole Euro-Atlantic security. The Euro-Atlantic security space, part of which is also Ukraine. So it's beyond NATO's territory. It's wider than that. And that is why all allies, all international communities stood and stand by Ukraine in its self-defense against Russian aggression. That is a right that is guaranteed in the UN Charter, which is the highest international legal document. Allies have provided lethal aid, non-lethal aid. We will continue to do so. Financial help, medical help, all the practical aspects of help that are just imaginable, including caring for Ukrainians who have escaped fighting from Ukraine. At the summit, allies also confirmed the comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, which will ensure that Ukraine receives further assistance, a variety of non-lethal assistance, be it secure communications, be it equipment to protect against chemical, biological, nuclear threats, and equipment for logistics, medical, many other needs that Ukraine has on an everyday basis. But allies also said that Ukraine will continue to receive weapons, the weapons that it needs to fight for its future, because currently Ukraine is faced with an armed attack. Allies said, and they meant it, that they will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that is how we see the relationship, because Ukraine is not only fighting for itself, it's fighting for the whole Euro-Atlantic security. It's fighting for the rules-based world where we can all live in peace, where our children can grow up in peace and can look into the future with a hope and reliance that nobody will attack us with armed force. We stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. I thank you.
I cannot but mention that it is a real pleasure to notice that the main points of our Ukrainian speakers does really echo the main points of the renewed NATO strategy. That's something to bear in mind when we're speaking about common future, and there's something to bear with yourselves after this event to understand the common purposes and the common goals of our partners and of ourselves. And for our last cyber international cross-transatlantic speech, I would like to ask our technical team to present to us the video address from Tanya Hartmann, the head of NATO's Eastern Partnership Division of the Political Relations and Security Policy Department. So, please.
First, I would like to express my sincere condolences to the Ukrainian people. We honor all those killed, injured, and displaced by Russia's aggression, as well as their families. We're in awe at the way Ukraine is fighting against the Russian war of aggression. The humanitarian crisis in Ukraine and conflict-related sexual violence are horrific, and Russia must be held accountable for its crimes. NATO and allies stand in full solidarity with Ukraine and are unwavering in their support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. You will hear more later about NATO and allies' support to Ukraine over the past 25 years. This discussion is very timely, coming as it does after the NATO summit in Madrid. Leaders took several decisions at the summit that will further develop and strengthen the distinctive partnership between NATO and Ukraine, with a focus on helping Ukraine defend itself from the illegal and unprovoked Russian invasion. The Madrid summit has been heralded as an important and transformative moment in the alliance's history. It recognized that the security environment is rapidly changing, and NATO must change too. Russia's war in Ukraine has galvanized NATO and allies in support of Ukraine. Allies are also working to address other global security challenges, including terrorism, China, as well as the food and energy crisis. In this context, on June 29, NATO heads of state and government approved a new strategic concept, setting out the alliance's priorities, core tasks, and approaches for the next decade. This was one of the major deliverables of the summit. The strategic concept describes the security environment facing the alliance, reaffirms NATO's values and purpose, and underscores NATO's commitment to its three core tasks: deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security. The strategic concept will also drive NATO's strategic adaptation and guide our future political and military development. Since the end of the Cold War, it has been updated only approximately every 10 years, so this is truly a historic moment. I would like to highlight 3 points about the new strategic concept relevant to the distinctive partnership between NATO and Ukraine. 1, it clearly recognizes that Russia is the most significant and direct threat to allies' security. 2, it recognizes a strong, independent Ukraine is vital for the stability of the Euro-Atlantic area. And 3, it reaffirms the historic decision of the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of NATO and commits to continue to develop the NATO-Ukraine partnership. I will now expand a bit on each of these points. Point 1. The new strategic concept defines Russia as the most significant and direct threat to allies' security. The Russian Federation's war of aggression against Ukraine has shattered peace and gravely altered our security environment. Its brutal and unlawful invasion, repeated violations of international humanitarian law, and heinous attacks and atrocities have caused unspeakable suffering and destruction. Moscow's behavior reflects a pattern of Russian aggressive actions against its neighbors and the wider transatlantic community. We cannot discount the possibility of an attack against allies' sovereignty and territorial integrity. NATO does not seek confrontation and poses no threat to the Russian Federation. We will continue to respond to Russian threats and hostile actions in a united and responsible way. We will significantly strengthen our deterrence and defense for all allies, enhance our resilience against Russian coercion, and support our partners to counter malign interference and aggression. In light of its hostile policies and actions, we cannot consider Russia to be our partner. However, we remain willing to keep open channels of communication with Moscow to manage and mitigate risks, prevent escalation, and increase transparency. We seek stability and predictability in the Euro-Atlantic area and between NATO and the Russian Federation. Any change in our relationship depends on Russia halting its aggressive behavior and fully complying with international law. Point 2. The new strategic concept recognizes that a strong, independent Ukraine is vital for the stability of the Euro-Atlantic area, and that the security of countries aspiring to become members of the alliance is intertwined with our own. Leaders committed to strongly support Ukraine. Point 3. The strategic concept reaffirms the decision of the 2008 Bucharest summit and all subsequent decisions with respect to Ukraine. Leaders reaffirmed NATO's open door policy as an expression of our fundamental values and our strategic interest in Euro-Atlantic peace and stability. Our door remains open to all European democracies that share the values of our alliance, which are willing and able to assume the responsibilities and obligations of membership, and whose membership contributes to our common security. Decisions on membership are taken by NATO allies on the basis of consensus, and no third party has a say in this process. Allies committed to continue to develop our partnership with Ukraine to advance our common interest in Euro-Atlantic peace, stability, and security. At the Madrid summit, leaders, jointly with Ukraine, decided on a strengthened package of support. The revised comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine includes a series of immediate, short-term measures of support, as well as a commitment to support Ukraine's medium and longer-term post-war reconstruction and reforms. The Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg summed this up after the summit, saying, "All of this shows our commitment to Ukraine's future, and that commitment is unshakable." I wish you a productive discussion. Thank you.
Так, дякуємо нашим колегам, які змогли знайти час та можливість виступити як мінімум з відеозверненнями. Насправді це дійсно в такий час є надзвичайно важливим. І тепер з деяким відчуттям співчуття.
Thank you to our colleagues who, in this time, made these presentations and welcoming speeches. That was very important for us. With this, I give the floor to Andrei Karakuts.
The moderator of the round-table discussion, and I want to give a floor for our first speaker, representative of NATO representation in Ukraine, Her Excellency McTear. Is Karen online? Yes. Okay.
Karen, please put on your camera.
Hello, Karen. Do you hear us? Yeah, okay. Floor is yours.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, very, very good.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you and see you very well.
Yeah, I have. I've got my camera and my mic on. Yeah. Everything's switched on.
Yeah, everything
Can
is
you not
working
see
well.
me?
Please start.
Yep, you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Really pleased to be here. Okay. It's a bit of a delay, I think. Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, very interesting. I've got another. Okay. So over the past 25 years, NATO and Ukraine have developed a unique partnership that has contributed to significant progress toward fulfilling Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Tanya Hartmann addressed NATO's new strategic concept and commitments to Ukraine in her introductory remarks, and Assistant Secretary General Braze covered the early history of NATO-Ukraine cooperation and current NATO support to help Ukraine defend itself against the illegal, unprovoked and brutal Russian invasion. I'll try not to repeat what they have said, but we'll focus on the work of the NATO representation to Ukraine, which I have led since January of this year. The Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity, the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea by Russia, and the Russian-instigated conflict in the Donbass in 2014 led to greatly increased cooperation between Ukraine and NATO. In 2016, the Comprehensive Assistance Package was established to support Ukraine's ability to provide for its own security and to implement wide-ranging reforms in the security and defence sector based on Euro-Atlantic principles and best practice. Since 2014, Ukraine has taken several important steps to deepen its relationship with NATO. In June 2017, the Ukrainian Parliament adopted legislation reinstating membership of NATO as a strategic foreign and security policy objective. And in 2019, a corresponding amendment to Ukraine's constitution came into force. President Zelensky approved Ukraine's new national security strategy in September 2020. This provides for the development of the distinctive partnership with NATO with the aim of membership. NATO recognizes that cooperation with Ukraine is not one way. It is mutually beneficial. Ukraine has provided significant contributions to NATO-led operations and exercises, such as to the KFOR mission in Kosovo, to NATO's maritime operations, and to the NATO response force. These contributions led allies to recognize Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner in 2020. This is a major success for Ukraine. It provides for more active dialogue, greater access to NATO exercises, increased information sharing, and lessons learned. The NATO representation to Ukraine has played a key role in strengthening the NATO-Ukraine partnership through supporting implementation of the CAP via 3 key strands of work: advisory expertise, trust funds, and capacity building programs. I'll just highlight some examples of the work that has been undertaken. Advisory support focuses on the security and defence sector as a whole. Allied advisors are subject matter experts seconded by NATO allies to Ukraine to assist with very specific subjects, for example, defence education, development of a non-commissioned officer system, logistics, and defence resource management. Our advisors supported the drafting process of the law on national security adopted in 2018 and are contributing to its implementation through support to the development of secondary legislation. In terms of defence reform, NRU advisors have been engaged in the development of strategic planning documents, including Ukraine's military security strategy and the Strategic Defence Bulletin. One other success story of our advisory collaboration is the Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, which work closely with the NATO Strategic SOF advisor. The reform of the security service of Ukraine is of paramount importance for Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic path. We strongly support the draft law on the security service of Ukraine, currently in the Verkhovna Rada, and consider it a promising basis for reform of the service. We really encourage the Verkhovna Rada to protect the reform-orientated provisions of the law in the final text. Over the past few years, NATO trust funds have helped build skills and increase cooperation in areas including professional military education, logistics and standardization, radioactive waste management, medical rehabilitation, explosive ordnance disposal, and countering improvised explosive devices. Some of these trust funds are now closed, but they have significantly contributed over the years. NATO is working with Ukraine in the professional development of civil servants in the security sector, as well as supporting building integrity in the security and defence sector. NATO has assisted Ukraine in developing and implementing a sustainable, effective and an integrated approach to military career transition and resettlement of military personnel. In 2016, we launched the NATO-Ukraine platform on countering hybrid warfare to support joint projects between NATO and Ukraine on such topics as crisis management, strategic communications, and building resilience. These projects are resulting in increased awareness and learning experiences for both Ukraine and NATO. NATO also supports building Ukraine's capacity in the area of strategic communications under the NATO-Ukraine STRATCOM Partnership Roadmap. Since the Russian invasion, NATO-Ukraine cooperation programs have remained, where possible, active. For instance, NATO has continued to support educational programs for Ukrainian psychologists. A number of activities are also ongoing in the area of professional military education, as well as in strategic communications, countering disinformation, and NCO development. We continue also to engage closely with Ukrainian civil society. I'm also pleased to have become a member of the Supervisory Board of the Ukrainian Veterans Fund of the Ministry of Veterans Affairs. Without doubt, the training, professional education, and equipment that NATO allies have provided since 2014 have supported Ukraine in building a stronger and more capable armed forces. As you've already heard, at the 2022 NATO summit in Madrid, allies agreed to strengthen the comprehensive assistance package. This enhanced CAP includes continuing to provide practical support in areas such as secure communications, fuel, medical supplies, body armor. It also includes initiatives to further strengthen and modernize Ukraine's defense and security institutions, and allies also agreed to help Ukraine transition from Soviet-era equipment to modern NATO equipment, boosting interoperability with allied forces. We are determined to do all we can to support Ukraine, as all allies understand the stakes of this war extend far beyond Ukraine. I've not given you an exhaustive list of support and cooperation, but hopefully enough that you get an idea about the breadth and depth of our collaboration. So I will stop there, you'll be pleased to hear, But just to say finally that I'm confident that the distinctive NATO-Ukraine partnership will continue to grow even stronger in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. And we have now time for several questions to Karen from our speakers and participants. So please, who is ready, microphone is in the hall, you can use it.
Please, if you have questions, please raise your hand.
Okay, I have a first question. It's concerning the work of your NATO representation in Ukraine. How it has changed from the start of the war, and will you try to enlarge your presence and to have a bigger scope of your work?
To changes to the structure of the NATO representation to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another questions? Okay, if we don't have other questions, Karen, please stay with us, and we will.
Sure.
Yes. We will move to our next speaker. Okay. Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, Chair of the Committee of Ukraine Integration into the EU, Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration in 2016-2019. Ivanna, floor is yours.
Дуже дякую. Мені дуже приємно.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased with today's discussion. Just as Mr. Ogryzko, I belong to the supporters and those who are stakeholders of the Ukrainian Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Their special position appeared in the Ukrainian government only in 2016 after my long-term insistence. Actually, this shows that our strong commitment may push forward even institutional changes in the government. During my stay in position of the Vice Prime Minister in European integration. We raised the issue, we had been raising the issue about the revival and extension of the charter about distinctive partnership between NATO and Ukraine. Today, this was not mentioned, and sometimes it happens that dynamics slows down and the involvement and level of commitment slows down, and you need to do such refreshments now and then. But at that time in 2016, we haven't reached that understanding with our NATO partners, and we hoped at that time that the charter had to be refreshed, and perhaps 25 years of the charter could be a good 25th anniversary of the charter could become a good moment to refresh it, to extend it. But nevertheless, this is a good moment to emphasize our extended activities at the moment when we stated our wish to become a part not just of the European Union but the part of NATO. This had not become the strong element of our foreign policy course. I believe that today, after the external events, after a series of internal strengthening of our solidarity, we will strengthen this cooperation with NATO, not as simply as an institution, but with but in practical areas. Actually, this is not just a repetition of the things which are important for us, but I fully agree with Mr. Ogryzko that when the war against Russian Federation would finish, then the next day, literally the next day, the decision about Ukraine's accession to NATO should be made. I do not see any other guarantee to the Ukraine security besides this decisive step, and I do not see any other options for guarantees of Ukraine's security. If the NATO members are ready to offer such guarantees, and if they are ready to send the troops and weapons the next day Ukraine is attacked, actually, which is the guarantee of security, then this means that they are ready to accept Ukraine as a NATO member. And as of today, we do not have any other option for the security guarantees for Ukraine as this one. Having gained the EU candidate status, we now have to focus on reaching the and satisfying the political and economic Copenhagen criteria. And the war is not an obstacle for that. I believe that those requirements which do not coincide with the standards, they are basic. The independence of the branches of power, implementation of the requirements would allow the NATO to make a decision about Ukraine's accession. These days we're getting very painful experience. These days we are very rapidly shifting from the old weaponry to mastering new weaponry. Actually, what we have to do else is to finalize the shift to the NATO standards of management and coordination. And I believe that having done this, we will reach the level of Finland and Sweden with all that I have mentioned. And as to our NATO, as to our partners, I should say that today you may contribute to practical actions needed in the country to comply with the European requirements. Today our colleagues from the Alliance mentioned the statements made at the G7 and which was confirmed at the NATO summit that North Atlantic countries are standing by Ukraine and that they are ready to support Ukraine as long as it is needed. I will try to recollect how it will stand as long as it takes.
Destruction if everyone is mobilized. Тобто це дійсно може бути потрібно менше часу.
That is, it will take much less time if this support comes from the alliance, and not only on the basis of bilateral level, but on the multilateral level, bringing together cyber cooperation, non-military support, and all sorts of support. For example, the ban on provision of lethal equipment for Ukraine was removed, and that is what we drastically need now to overcome this war. And the main task in the NATO's security concept is a long-term security and stability, and this will open time for that. If you have questions, you may ask them now. Yevhen Shulga, Ostriv TV. I have a question to Ivanna. You mentioned that Ukraine might be access to NATO just as Sweden and Finland, but in those countries, armies were already technically tuned in line with NATO standards or satisfied the NATO standards. It seems to me that you a bit did not take into account this aspect. I did not put aside that aspect. I mentioned that due to the specific features of the current invasion and due to the limited access to the Soviet weaponry, which we mastered long ago, but it is not available now in sufficient quantity. So now we have to transfer to the contemporary state-of-the-art of Western weapons, and we are doing this very quickly. Some 4 or 5 months ago, it was not possible to imagine that Ukraine would get this weaponry and that Ukraine would master operation of that weaponry. It was not possible. Just a small example, a shift from 152 artillery to 155 millimeter artillery, and this is actually the shift to the NATO standards. And I emphasize that we have to refocus from the military to the managerial NATO standards, because we already started with the military standards. We have also to focus on the bringing security service and the judiciary branch to the standards of NATO countries, and this will be actually fundamental principles of any NATO member country. Introduction of control, supervision, civilian, parliamentary oversight over our defense and security components. This will allow us to move forward and make decisions which are useful for Ukraine. I believe that is what we have to do in our security and defense sector. Also, we have to focus on political criteria which are important for the membership in the European Union. Actually, they are fully coinciding with what is needed for NATO membership. This is the rule of law, this is democracy, protection of human rights, the balance of powers, and capacity of institutions to implement policy, not politics. I would support Ivanna in her conclusion, and posing your question, you will actually answer the question. Could you recollect any recent NATO member from among the Balkan countries and characterize the military forces of such a Balkan country? I can answer. In Montenegro, army is just 2,000 soldiers, and actually this shows that accession of Montenegro was a political decision. I am representative of an NGO of Ruska Union. I have a question about the connection between Euro-Atlantic integration and the constitution of Ukraine. How do you think approval of the new constitution is determined with the Ukraine's aspiration with the North Atlantic structures, and Ukraine's accession to NATO would depend on the position of minorities which are in unfavorable position in Ukraine. What do you think about granting legal status to part of your minorities? Thank you for your question. You will have a possibility to ask this later in the next session. You mentioned that currently Ukrainian military forces are compliant with the requirements of NATO, but the NATO basic requirement that the country should be a sustainable democracy, and in line with that requirement, we are not fully compliant with it. And at least some NATO members believe that, and how we can convince them that we comply with the NATO democratic requirements. There are not 30 but 32 NATO members, and quite recently attending NATO summit, I've noticed 2 empty chairs for new members, and my first thought was that it was reserved for Ukraine and Georgia, but it appeared that it was reserved for Finland and Sweden, and I hope that in future there will be not just 32 but 34 NATO members. Here much will depend on us, because the armed forces of Ukraine today stand for the free, democratic, independent state which had chosen its path independently. And I believe that bloodshed into which we were involved to respond to the violence, and all our support to our armed forces, which are targeting the Euro-Atlantic integration, that all that aspirations will turn into a practical compliance with the Copenhagen requirements. I believe that the efforts of Ukrainian armed forces, the efforts of our European partners who granted us the EU candidate status, and the prerequisites which they set for us by the end of the year, I believe that all that are very favorable requirements to Ukraine. And by the way, media should contribute to this universal national strive, and I believe that our NATO partners will also help us.
Speaker, Yevhen Burkat, Acting Head of Directorate of Information Policy on Defense and Strategic Communication, Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Your Excellency, floor is yours.
Добрий день. Я хотів би трошки доповнити.
Good afternoon. I would add to what Mr. Ogryzko mentioned as to the charter, which was signed on July 9th in 1997 in Madrid, but political decision about signing was made at the ministerial conference NATO defense ministers, which was in late May 1997 in Portugal, in Sintra. July 9, 1997 was the final moment in a series of actions performed by Ukrainian politicians and the Ukrainian military forces. I also would like to remind you that back in 1997, in the Washington NATO summit, the status of NATO Ukraine Charter was raised. It had become a part of the NATO, a key component. It had become compulsory for implementation of all the NATO partners, allies. Then I would like to emphasize that the level of resistance which Ukrainian army had demonstrated to Russian aggressor, both at the beginning of the war in February, in March, and which it continues to demonstrate now. So the surprise of NATO allies reflects the fact that this high level of resistance is actually a deliverable, a result, positive result of the NATO assistance provided by NATO instructors and to Ukrainian soldiers, and by participation of Ukrainian armed forces in many military exercises, joint military exercises with NATO, both outside and inside Ukraine. Actually, this high level of resistance is a result of a long-term cooperation and deep partnership, deep joint work. And one more remark, the new reality of aggression and resistance to it, and new strategic concept of NATO. All these elements of new reality encourage all the branches in Ukraine, the parliament, the government, and civil society, to look for new maybe approaches or regulations to find new ways to our cooperations with NATO. Ivanna mentioned about the need to amend the strategy in Ukraine in response to the approval of the new strategic concept for NATO. And I believe that very soon the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine would initiate a roundtable with several panels to discuss all the aspects of how to amend the Ukrainian strategy. Any further questions? Do we have Mr. Chernev online? Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Valeriy, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Ukraine to the USA in 2015-2019. Thank you for the questions which you pose today, because this actually reflects the more general questions from Ukrainian people. And I will start with the statement that my career contributed to the Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine, not at the governmental level, but also from the public awareness raising side. When I just started that 25 years ago, that about 16% of Ukraine's citizens who supported Ukraine's NATO membership, while now this amounts to 90% of course, that happened due to the occupation of Crimea and of the war. We understand clearly that NATO membership is the best model for ensuring Ukraine's security. I would mention two things. First of all, the constitutional aspect of NATO membership, and the second will be about current situation and our move forward. Why I've mentioned the Constitution and its amendment. During the last several months, especially Istanbul summit, when the Russia insisted that and Ukraine rejected from the NATO membership, and the disarmament started, and Russia rejected to participate in the military exercises, in joint military exercises. That was the extreme position, and we had to make that decisions under pressure. The situation was rather critical at that time, and as it is now, when the president of Ukraine emphasized that NATO membership is our key priority, and that it is a pity that there is no 100% support for that in NATO. That is, NATO membership should be our priority. During the next month, we will see the increasing need for that. The intensity of war will rise during several next months, and that is not just about the front line, but this is about that's true about economy of the country, political realities, humanitarian situation, etc. And this brings me to the statement which I've been doing for years and years. In 2010, when NATO aspirations of Ukraine were crossed out, and today, when you hear that Ukraine, according to effective legislation, should be or is a neutral country, it has to be nuclear-free country with the references to the state sovereignty of Ukraine, then this views expressed publicly are not true and do not coincide with the Constitution of Ukraine. When the Declaration of Ukrainian Independence and Sovereignty was passed, then the drafting of the constitution was started. In that primary version, it was Article 20, where Ukraine rejected from participation in any military blocs and neutrality. Then this chapter was thrown out into a trash because all the deep research and actual life demonstrated that neutrality of Ukraine is not possible. Ukraine has to join the collective security systems. And when Russia, with its actions, had closed all the alternatives to NATO membership, we have no other way than to raise once again discussions about collective security. Today, we lack the organization that we had in the past. The Western European Union was eliminated, and now NATO is the only one organization which ensures security in the European continent. Of course, Ukraine is not a member of that organization, and I think it was a huge mistake in 2008 when Ukraine was rejected in provision of the action plan, membership action plan. But now we have a very realistic opportunity, very actual opportunity that we can go forward to access NATO. In my opinion, many of our standards and many of our programs fully comply with NATO on the one hand, and upon deoccupation of Ukraine, NATO will need to think carefully how to ensure security in Europe. And Ukraine should be inside European security system, but not outside. But I won't be that radical as Ms. Klympush-Tsintsadze was when she said that the next day Ukraine should become the member of NATO, the next day upon the occupation. I do not think that this may happen the next day, but actually now the president had emphasized that Ukraine has strong NATO aspirations, and Ukraine is willing to join the security system in Europe. This is a strong step forward. Without security, nothing will be possible, neither assistance nor investments or progress. That is, we have to express our joint position clearly. We want to be NATO member. That is what we observed recently with the EU candidate status, joint commitment and joint action of civil society, the government, the president, the parliament, resulted in the positive decision about candidate status. Then, aggressive actions of Putin forced Finland and Sweden to join NATO within several months, and the same will happen to Ukraine. Ukraine does not have other alternatives, and moreover, NATO does not have other alternatives. And thank you. Looking at the experience of Finland and Sweden, Russia had clearly stated that it does not see any problems with the accession of NATO and Finland of Sweden and Finland to NATO. Oleg Boychun, founder of the NATO Atlantic Council. The war has many aspects. One of the aspects is adaptation of military and servicemen. The war will be over, and we are members of Ukraine Smart Coalition, and we had submitted to 6 ministries our vision of social adaptation, and we received no response from them. We would like to hear from you. Who will deal with the adaptation of servicemen after the war? Then, about Lugano conference and cooperation, may we expect that Lugano effort will be as weak as our Euro-Atlantic integration? I will try to answer, although I am not in the government now and I am not responsible to them. About rehabilitation of Ukrainian servicemen, I think that you are right. We do not fully understand how much cooperation exists between NATO and its future members when we were not involved into that activities. But actually they did much for Ukraine, and all that coordination and all that work that had been happening between NATO member countries and Ukraine on bilateral base, it prepared a higher level of cooperation now. I fully agree with you that after the first round, after the first phase of war, since 2014, we had hundreds of thousands veterans, while now we will have millions of veterans. The issue of rehabilitation, of adaptation, post-war adaptation of the veterans, this issue will be huge. And currently, I hear discussions about the governmental reform of the government, and the central executive body that will take care about veterans should become one of the major structures with good budget and to take care about veterans. And they are going to cross out such a ministry. But I believe that the existence of such central executive body taking care of the veterans is very important. In the United States and other Western countries, they have very strong attitude towards veterans, and they do not just have a ministry, they also have a huge lobby, pro-veteran lobby in the Congress, and during any elections in the United States, there is a special question about the attitude towards veterans. And in Ukraine, this will also become one of the important aspects of domestic policy. Since 2014, we had been having the influx of veterans and the issue raised. You are quite right that bureaucracy has to feel that the issue about veterans is a priority. As for Lugana, I perhaps will not speak much. I will speak about security aspect because I dealt with this security bigger part of my career. When you discuss the funding in terms of recovery plan, then you see 15 billion investment into the security sector. But actually, statement of the needs of statement how much money do you need? This is just the very first step, just 100, just 1% out of 100% that should be done. As for the defense projects, there is no coherent program there as far as I understand. The military and in the military complex, some of our projects are successful, some are not successful. Even when there are money, there is readiness to allocate money. The quality of public administration and available capacity. These are key drivers. If we have something to suggest, I hope that the things that we want to suggest will be heard. In Lugano, before Lugano, or in London, it is important to keep focus of attention on Ukraine. We do not know what will happen tomorrow. The US delegation came and promised 265 billion for reconstruction projects, but the biggest issue is to keep focus of attention on Ukraine, because in the following month, in next following month, it won't be that easy. For some time, I'd been a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Defense, and being a member of that committee, I found out, that was 3 years ago, I found out that more than 40,000 of servicemen in Ukraine had no proper accommodation and housing. And at that time, we prepared a report and submitted it to the authorities. And by the way, a key aspect to resolve it is to liquidate and to curb corruption. By the way, as a civil society organization, you are also responsible for what the Ministry of Defense will do in that area. That is, we have to bring together the effort of authorities who fight against corruption and of the civil society which fights against corruption. So the question is correct, but you should think what can be done on the veteran side. Maybe they have to create an organization and act on behalf of that organization. I would like to remind to those who watch our broadcast, and you may ask questions. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Hanna Shalas, Director of Security Programs at the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. I can hear you. Thank you for invitation. I would like to be together with you, but now trip even from Odessa had become an issue. On the one hand, it is not so easy to add something after almost 2 hours of discussion, and I do not wish to repeat what was said, so I will speak not about the past, but about the future. The speakers mentioned their experiences during 25 years, but the war which we see today, someday it will be finished, and what we can do to strengthen the partnership, the distinctive partnership. And what this partnership should mean, how we can move forward, how we can use this partnership, distinctive partnership, to become closer to NATO. Unfortunately, during the last year, we had seen one more issue with the deficit of trust and strategic communication. If you look at the rhetoric which we had from the NATO headquarters during the first months of the war, each statement started with NATO could not do during that first month of aggression. That resulted in our special letter requesting NATO not to say what they cannot do, but to start with saying what they can do. we emphasized that negative statements were destroying trust in Ukraine. Quite understandable that NATO is a defensive alliance, and they could not do much during the first weeks. But NATO was very supportive of Ukrainians. Just like it happened in 2014, at the beginning of the war, there was a growth of Ukrainians supporting, there were growth among Ukrainians supporting NATO membership of Ukraine. Then, of course, there was an aggression, and then it dropped considerably when NATO started that negative rhetoric, what they could not do. And only now the numbers and percentage of supporters of NATO in Ukraine had grown 10%. Understanding that the war continues not just on the battlefield, but in the informational space, and this always has to be kept in mind in all our interactions with NATO. So this informational space, communication, should be always kept in mind. And what Valeriy mentioned as to the security guarantees, there's a big gap of communication. Whether the security guarantees are instead of NATO membership, or this is a substitute, or this is additional to NATO membership, or whatever. So security guarantees were mentioned in the Budapest Memorandum, which is has become quite famous, and this is the weak point. Today we observed Finlandization 2.0, when Finland has changed its strategical direction and is heading to NATO now. The new Madrid concept is quite interesting. That is what we mentioned before, that there was good coordination between the new NATO strategic concept and realities. And not only in terms of the relations with Russia. And we should not look just on the articles of the concept which deal with Ukraine, but we should not apply this approach. We should look at the concept, new concept as a whole. We should keep in mind that there might be areas where Ukraine could be interesting to the allies, to NATO allies. Ukraine may fit to a chapter about climate, when climate is interesting to our partners, we start discussions on climate, which is proper thing during the war. Also, cybersecurity is the issue which we might discuss with our NATO partners. Resilience, this is another area which could be discussed. Logistic processes. We may analyze how 7 principles of resilience were applied and could be applied in Ukraine in future. Ukrainian concept of state resilience was developed with direct application of the alliance recommendations. So we should communicate better what else we can cooperate with the alliance even in this period of war. And also I would like to draw attention to the following aspects that now we have to revise the candidate member countries, and these are very different countries like Australia, Ukraine, Georgia. What can we do in these conditions? Of course, additionally to the extended exchange of information and military exercise. And now the issue of the Black Sea. We do not see any strategic concept of the alliance as to the Black Sea. The alliance continues to see the Black Sea as the area of its neighborhood, but not the area of its presence. But when Romania and Bulgaria are members to NATO, they perhaps have to change this attitude. We should bring these negotiations about Black Sea to a new level and demonstrate that Ukraine and Georgia membership might strengthen positions of NATO in the Black Sea. And the last but not least, in the conditions of war, we will need to review our annual national program. As of now, we have the active law about annual program this year. Perhaps this is the right moment to change this document. Whether this document will continue to be open document or it should be the classified document with restricted access. And the issue, how this document should look like, whether it will remain the bilateral document or whether it will be coordinated with other documents, or whether we will need oversight and control from outside, from our NATO partners, to stimulate the reforms which are described in that document. For example, the SBU reform. or the strengthened protection of information. So, coming to our 25th anniversary, we can discuss the strengthening of the Charter, but we should look on on our capacity under existing documents. For our partners, it's easier to work on the framework which is already in place instead of creating new framework, because new framework would require new bureaucracy and coordination with the opposition of other NATO members like Hungary, which agreed with Ukraine's status with extended capacity on, but blocks Ukraine NATO committee sittings at the top level. That is, we have to set new strategic goals, but we have to find new opportunities to act in the framework which already exists. And this will underscore that our overall objective was, is, and will exist, and this will emphasize our commitment to see it implemented. Thank you, Hanna. Thank you. Now let us open Q&A session. Oksana. I'm Oksana Grigorieva. I represent the Ukrainian Council, although now I work in the armed forces of Ukraine, and I've been dealing with NATO issues for 25 years. I'm happy to see familiar faces, and you had been my professors long ago. I'm only unhappy that now our distinguished speakers are not decision makers in NATO. Hanna, I disagree with you that there is no such thing as security. We had seen that and felt that on our own experience. Of course, we are very grateful for that support which NATO provides to us. But I disagree when the NATO representatives call this conflict aggression, but not the war. Please do not be scared with the word war, because this is the war. Unless you stop calling it conflict or aggression and start mentioning it as a war, you risk that tomorrow this war may become part of your reality, and you will see the armed people, the gang rapers, and criminals on your territory. Those people who stopped Ukraine at the Bucharest summit, they also have voters in their own countries. We have to show clearly to the Western Europeans that when we knock into the door, and we are not allowed to enter through the door, we have to knock at the window. either Ukraine is a NATO member or Ukraine would not exist. The enemies may occupy us just with their huge human forces. Russia has a lot of storages with with Soviet time missiles, and it is less expensive to launch them onto Ukraine than to destroy it safely. Ukraine is not different from Iraq, Libya. Why there is no such mission for Ukraine as for those countries? Maybe you have further comments or questions, Hanna? Maybe I would like to comment on what you just said, rather emotionally. I fully agree with you. Quite often we heard that in the war that Russia started in 2014, it was provoked by NATO. I disagree with this interpretation. I read a book by Mr. Ogryzko and Mr. Vasilenko. I agree with them that Russia would attack anyway, and there is still a chance that Russia may attack NATO. But this is now the right moment to say once again why NATO do not make political decision. Russia is a nuclear state with a huge army, and they have concerns. If you speak about the NATO structures, then there are more supporters. As we speak about the politicians of the alliance, if they try to put on table the advantages and disadvantages of the Ukraine's membership in NATO, but we never would agree with anything that Russia may perceive Ukraine's membership negatively. Russia had shown it in its full capacity and tried to use this chance. It would be just if the armies of other countries should fight, or at least they should provide Ukraine with the weaponry, which is paid by their taxpayers. And unless NATO comes to the full understanding that for the threat of Russia would be NATO countries, and this should just become a pragmatic calculation for the security in Europe. NATO has to make rapid decision about Ukraine's membership in NATO. Anna Shelest brought me to the idea what could be done with plans, with documents in current conditions. Now our central government keeps saying, just accept us as Sweden and Finland. In my opinion, during the next summit in Vilnius, we should get either MAP document, let it be for 1 year, for 2 years, what specifically should be done before Ukraine is given the membership status, and even the guarantees of security guarantees should be granted to Ukraine immediately, even for the period of MAP action, just like it was granted immediately to Sweden and Finland. We should have the decision and 1 or 2 year perspective of Ukraine's membership. Otherwise, the war in Europe will continue and extend. So the compromise solution, trade-off solution could be security guarantee from NATO to Ukraine with the clear membership plan within 1 or 2 years. We have one more speaker. I will add a couple of words to what Mr. Charlie mentioned. You've heard about security guarantees. I would suggest us to look into the mirror. Currently, we're standing like near the church and begging, please provide us with proper missiles reaching for 300 kilometers. Please allow us to do the Kerch Bridge that will prevent them from offensive in the south. But Ukraine was the country producing missiles with a range of 10,000 kilometers. How we had reached this our situation when we are begging for something, and it was not NATO, it was Ukraine who lost that capacity. When we are speaking about our potential membership in NATO, and those who are trembling today because they are not sure what might happen in future. Quite recently, the Estonian Prime Minister said that security guarantees, NATO security guarantees for Estonia when it would be liberated in 6 months is actually not an option. That may be too late to liberate anything after 6 months. Do we want such a guarantee? No. Accessing to NATO, which should be able to ensure our guarantees and to support it with our own capacity. That is, we have to revive our missile, long-range missile production. While today we hear about some security guarantees, the guarantee that if somebody attacks us, then somebody will provide us with guarantees. No, that's nonsense. We should have the guarantee that nobody would attack us because we are members of a big alliance, which is called NATO. And the second, the most important, that if anybody attacks us, we are able to a strong repeal. Thank you. And now I'm inviting To the microphone, our next speaker, Mariana Fakhurdinova, Research Fellow at the New Europe Center. Thank you for invitation. Much had been said. But nevertheless, I would share some comments about Ukraine-NATO partnership for 25 years. Partnership between Ukraine and NATO had been good, but it had not become very ambitious. Quite often, NATO countries lacked resolution or ambition to make Ukraine a partner. We have deepened our cooperation quite strong during the 25 years, but we have gained neither membership action plan nor no partnership. But quite often political will may prevail over technical rules, procedures, etc. That is what we have seen on the example of Sweden and Finland. During 25 years, NATO and Ukraine had been moving with different speeds. While Ukraine encouraged NATO to be more objective in terms of in its vision of Russia, NATO looked for new dialogue, and no decisive steps were taken in 2014, and any steps of both NATO and the EU were becoming more resolute only in response to the more brutal actions of Russia, and only after outbreak of the strongest after 1945 war in Europe in February this year, NATO had seen this threat to the Euro-Atlantic space. Our Center in Europe back in 2020, jointly with Georgian partners, submitted recommendations to the new strategic concept of NATO, where Russia was recognized as a new strategic threat. And only now our NATO countries have understood the truth of that document. For a long time, the alliance rejected to provide Ukraine with lethal equipment, while now it became possible. But after a huge number of victims, about civilians, about atrocities, after crimes, etc. Quite recently, President of France mentioned that that was not possible to supply Ukraine with aircrafts and other equipment, but maybe after more victims incurred to Ukraine, this position may change. Nevertheless, all that facts do not devaluate cooperation between NATO and Ukraine, which was mentioned by many of my colleagues. And the positive things which we have got, this is increasing combat capacity of Ukrainian army due to the military exercise and strengthened communication. Then the level of NATO standards implementation in Ukrainian army. At the beginning of 2021, 20% of NATO standards were implemented in Ukrainian army. These were operational and administration, while today we implement NATO standards in the man force in material. Actually, this is very positive change. And another big achievement in our cooperation with NATO is introduction of best practices from the US, from NATO countries, and launch of important reforms, establishment of both civilian and military control, supervision over armed forces, and participation in joint intelligence operations. And actually, during the years of the charter existence, a new generation of Ukrainians had grown up, and due to their cooperation with the NATO, we understand how the army should like, how the proper democratic state should look like. I hope that with the support of the partners, we will be able to build up such a democratic state. The only thing is to preserve it. I would ask the team to connect Ms. Karen McTear with us.
Again, I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that I've heard during the discussion. The first of which was the comment about the language that NATO uses when talking about what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. Just to be really clear, we do use the words war, we do use invasion. In my introductory speech, I talked about, the brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine. These strong words we do use because we understand that that is exactly what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. Also, really interesting to hear about the discussion about rehabilitation and social adaptation for soldiers, for military personnel. I think what I would like to say on that is I think they are two separate issues. We're talking medical and psychological rehabilitation as one subject. Social adaptation, i.e. what happens to service personnel once they leave the armed forces, is a separate issue, and that's one that the NATO representation to Ukraine has been working on over the years with our Military Career Transition Trust Fund, now a programme, working closely with the Ministry of Veterans on that and with other ministries as well. On the rehabilitation, psychological rehabilitation, we're currently looking, my military career transition team are currently looking at what the requirement is in this space, because we absolutely understand that this is a really serious issue and a really critical issue in Ukraine at the moment, with a huge number of stakeholders picking up on the comment that in the question about 6 different ministries. That's exactly what we're finding, a large number of stakeholders, and it's trying to sort of pick through that and work out how we deal with that. Also, just to say, one of the comments from another colleague was about determining the future requirements. What the CAP, the Comprehensive Assistive Programme review, will do is work with Ukrainian colleagues in determining what programs and projects should look like. This won't be NATO pushing things on Ukraine. This will be working with our colleagues to determine what we're going to do. Your point about negative rhetoric and the war in the information space, completely agree with that. And I do think that the Madrid Summit Declaration and the comments about the CAP, Comprehensive Assistance Programme, do represent a kind of a sort of reset, if you like, in terms of the language being used. And I think that, as far as the strategic concept is concerned, I think the points Tanya Hartman made in her introductory remarks, are really relevant as far as a sort of, I'm not going to call it a reset, but a different perspective. NATO, as I said in my introductory remarks, NATO can learn from Ukraine, absolutely, and this will be key as we move the relationship forward. And then the final point I wanted to pick up on was the comment about Black Sea security. NATO has significantly strengthened defence in the eastern part of the alliance, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, with troops, with ships, with planes, and you're absolutely spot on. The significance of the Black Sea and Black Sea security should not and must not be underestimated. That was my comments based on the discussion, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency.
Just respond on your mentioned trust, support Ukraine rehabilitation. I wanted to sense, because as ambassador in the United States, its only option for me was to transport our hero, Mayor Petrokivsky, by NATO support. And it's a huge money. This NATO, just in 5 days, it's for bureaucratic NATO structures, so it's not easy. But really thankful that sometimes this support from Trust Fund, from others, is just about lives of our warriors, lives of our officers and soldiers. Thank you. I use this opportunity to thank NATO for this continuous support in this particular sphere.
Thank you. Як ми бачимо, час дуже швидко плине. В нас є ще...
That we have almost run out of time. We have a time for just one question. Well, we have been working for 2.5 hours now, and I would like to thank our participants, to our speakers. Thank you so much for your open discussion. Valeriy, would you like to make the final statement? Actually, today we had not a celebration or an anniversary, but it was a fruitful discussion. I would like to thank the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center team and to the distinguished moderators who managed to stuck with time and planning this event. We understood that USA experts and journalists were able to ask interesting, good questions. Thank you. And together with our partners, the NATO Documentation and Information Center and the External Policy Center, Ukrainian Prism, and the International Security Center, and the Group of Strategic and Security Studies. I'm very grateful to all our partners, and from all the official figures and in NATO, I've understood that each word that you said today was heard and understood, and that this made our discussion very fruitful. And eventually, you will become Ukraine will become the NATO member. Thank you.